Hello everyone, today we resume after years for no particular reason, just as for having stopped this back then, our series about the Roman provinces. Naturally, there is a playlist dedicated to this, but does not quite include just this, because of course talking Roman history, Roman Empire, you talk provinces at the end of the day, but this is just a very specific history of how Roman provinces came into being and how essentially they developed under imperial rule until basically the 3rd century AD. Today we talk about Roman Asia, right? Also preserving, of course, the official name in the Latin restituta pronunciation. And talking about Roman Asia, we're talking essentially, we'll look at the geographical boundaries more in depth, but about West Asia Minor, what would be today's Western Anatolia. It was, by the way, one of the single most advanced provinces in Mediterranean, historically before the Romans, through mostly their Hellenistic legacy, but not only. All right. At some point, we will cover in depth also some proper civilian history, so to say, of all these regions. I'm working on this because, again, the various branches at some point will be exhausted. You must sort of refurbish them in that way. And this area had been controlled by different Hellenistic powers. After the Seleucids were expelled from the Anatolian Peninsula due to the Roman victory at Magnesia, I made a video about this battle in that video about the Manipular Legion versus the Macedonian phalanx. It's one of the single biggest, most important battles out there. And basically, Antiochus III had been crushed by, namely, the brother of the Africanus that was, however, also there. There is all the issue of the trial to the Scipiones later that I also made a video on, so if you're interested in the context, there is a lot to that. And the stipulations of the Peace of Apamea, as it followed the following year, 188 BC. This marked probably the conclusion of the triumphant war against King Antiochus III, and following approximately a couple of generations of Roman supremacy and governance over the remaining Hellenistic kingdoms, Rome assumed the role of the successor also to the Pergamene rulers without further warfare. Right, that was essentially an extortion, or at least a grant that the Attalid power in Pergamon would be preserved under Roman rule. The Seleucids went on until essentially the age of Pompey, that reorganized Assyria, properly put an end to even this essential realm from its former glory of the Diadochoi era. This land of Asia will become one of the single most important ones, especially in the later Republic, given the enormous wealth that funded different Roman enterprises across the Mediterranean. In fact, Anatolia encompassed the most affluent, fertile, and extensively Hellenized areas, including the Troad, Aeolis, Mysia, Ionia, Lydia, and Caria. All these countries had a different background, but they had been heavily Hellenized and eventually compacted also under some more Hellenistic monarchic form to maintain a great deal of wealth, but also a relatively easy governability. Right, and these regions were sort of more... were a bit less liberty-seeking than, say, the Hellas, for example, that we still haven't covered. But in this sense, they were also better disposed towards Rome. They're also, frankly, abused of the local administration. King Attalus III of Pergamon passed away in 133 BC. Having designated the Romans as heirs to his kingdom through his veritable will, while Pergamon, possibly alongside other poleis of the region, was granted the status of a free city. However, the senatorial delegation sent from Rome to administer the new territory faced a rebellious land in the moment. In fact, famously enough, Aristarchus, Attalus III's half-brother, did not accept Roman overlordship and declared himself king. In the name of essentially collecting the Attalic legacy and securing support at that point also from Macedonian colonies, so essentially military settlements that had historically been distributed across the region, across the different lands as well, not necessarily all the ones ruled by the Attalids. We explained how, by the way, I made a video about the Pergamene army organization under the Attalids, and these are a bit of a curious Diadochoi kingdom, as they were pretty powerful, pretty wealthy, as Pergamon was one of the greatest Hellenistic centers in the world. But at the same time, it was not as military powerful entity, given mostly the limit of its territorial expansion. I mean, along the coasts, as we've seen, they were literally the most developed centers ever, but they were not structured like major sort of land masses, as even, Macedon as a whole could be, the Seleucid Empire, at least in Syria and Mesopotamia, or Ptolemaic Egypt. By this point, at the end of the 2nd century BC, there was, however, a great deal of general decline of the broader Hellenistic Macedonian military system. One of the results was that basically nobody here involved was capable of levying a functional Macedonian phalanx anymore, the Attalids having never actually seemingly fielded one. Right? We've explained this thoroughly enough in the video, in fact, about the Attalid army organization. However, this general malaise had struck the same rural communities that would rise in rebellion. Not that Rome will soon have issues with slaves in southern Italy, through similar dynamics, in fact, of a sort of broader Hellenistic world, so to say, in Magna Graecia. In fact, several ancient Hellenic polis of the same Attalid domains and general, allies or subjects, because that's what the Hellenistic hierarchy of power had been about, also rebelled against Rome. Aristarchus was provided with some sort of more than provincial level of power in this rebellion. This obviously had been sparked by this central pressure that Rome had made on Attalus III, that had basically given up the notion of independence over his country, but some others hadn't within the same. Initially, Rome misjudged both the uprising and the rebels' strategic potential and capabilities, and the prolonged intense war, in fact, was resolved only 4 years later by the consul of Manius Aquilius, where in 129 BC, who remained, in fact, for the subsequent 3 years to establish it further as a province. Strabo 14:138 tells. This is relevant because, obviously, the Romans did not have at this point a major statalization of power. They didn't have any major bureaucracy. They were just, pretty aggressively expanding warlike people that was ruling vast expanses of Mediterranean just in virtue of their deterrent power, their capacity of intervention. It's not like Aristarchus ever put in tatters like the Roman control of the Aegean or something, but of course there was this lagging time in Rome for different political reasons, also lack of interest at some point to respond to these rebellions. If anything, Asia was too important to be simply left alone, and many Romans were coveting, in fact, the subcontracting of local administration. And that's what it would also become famous for. Most of the corruption, bribe, abuses later Republic would pass through these provinces fundamentally. Think about concussion, the matter of the repetundis, etc. They mostly revolve around the first estates of Rome's abuse and oppression of these lands. Mithridates V king of Pontus, and the sons of Ariarathes V, king of Cappadocia, who died in battle, for actually helping Rome against this Attalid resurgence, were awarded Phrygia and portions of Lycaonia, respectively. This is relevant because, of course, the Romans made plenty of use of this other neighboring populations as auxiliaries, as already the Roman Imperium was basically co-opting and lording over these areas. It's sort of ironic that the same pontiffs would carry out a major Roman slaughter, as you know, in the region, rebelling against Rome. But again, these were also easily accessible lands, like very easily reachable by sea, by logistics. These eastern rulers of different matrices, culturally wise, were more hinterland powers that, as sort of sometimes importantly extended territorially wise, would never sort of threaten the overall unity of, again, the Roman lake, as we can see the Mediterranean at this point. Besides, these kingdoms were, and the parts of Phrygia and Lycaonia were relatively less fertile and urbanized, and so they could simply be subcontracted to these other rulers in the moment. After all, Rome just wanted stability, not this major investment. At this point, it was enough to control the Mediterranean coastlands. Rome was basically a century away from properly a continental choice of expansion, especially in Europe, by the way, as that was just by manpower and resources that by far the most important part of the empire that could and would maintain itself for such a long time. In 119 BC, following Mithridates V's death, Phrygia was reclaimed and incorporated by the Romans into the province of Asia. Ephesus, rather than Pergamon, was chosen as the capital of the new province, with its temple of Artemis, one of the marvels of the ancient world, and yet another great Hellenistic city, although not as big and florid as Pergamon had historically been, were really marvels, of also ancient archaeology, stemmed from, thanks also to the abductions, let's say, carried out in our last centuries. Now, it should be noted, however, that the term capital is used here just to refer to the city where the Roman governor typically resided. So there wasn't a real concept of capital, of central city per se. We've seen also in other videos, for example, about Bithynia and Pontus, that would battle over these kind of privilege of hosting the governor, having more of a say in the government of the province, thus. But it was all done in a very sort of privatized, fluid fashion. That was, by the way, characteristic even probably of the Hellenistic world. That was not so homogeneously ordained like the Roman one in principle. At this point, the Romans weren't colonizing much these areas that were already civilized and obedient on their own. The privileges, for example, of Ephesus consisted in the governor requiring to visit the center first upon entering the province, not even simply residing there. So it's all relatively debatable. We know this from Ulpian, for example, Ulpian 1 de Officio Proconsulis. We don't even, in fact, use the term capital in this historiographical context. Pergamon, an ancient stronghold in Mysia selected by Lysimachos, that I also made a video on the army of, for its renowned inaccessibility to safeguard his treasury, was not the most suitable location for the governor's seat. Right. While Pergamon was undoubtedly enhanced and magnificently adorned by the Attalid rulers, Ephesus, as an ancient and still prominent city, re-established on the coast by Lysimachus, that also demanded quite a lot of forces from that around 295, emerged as the most appropriate choice for fulfilling all the functions required of a provincial capital, so to say. The responsibility entrusted to Manius Aquilius in organizing the new province of Asia closely aligned with our sense probably of Romanization, of provincialization, that tended naturally to unify many local offices, to co-opt local elites, and so render a Roman government much easier. Roman intervention in this and nearly all other domains was characterized by the typical strong pragmatism and high degree of adaptability in addressing different situations. There was no kind of national unity to this territory. Again, in spring, I've received a series of questions regarding ethnos in antiquity, and the more we look at Eastern provinces, because we have already done this also outside of this series, we point out the heterogeneity of this world. The fact that it doesn't matter how wealthy and affluent the entire system was, as a whole, it was also very unequal, right? Very stratified, very really different from within itself. For example, the Anatolian hinterland at large was not as civilized as by the brutal degree that the coast really was then. Therefore, the apparent orderliness and structure of especially the Roman initial organization may be deceptive, or at least the Romans, as we were saying before here, were not really going with immediately an iron fist. I mean, in terms of relations, of how you pose yourself towards Rome, yes, in a strictly strategical sense. But the Romans, again, did not care too much. They didn't even have the centuries-old structured capacity that they will have acquired, in fact, at the end of this video's timeline, to cope with probably the reformation of an entire provincial administration. A significant level of flexibility was just necessary, due also to this lack of brutalization of the population was not really needed. And because, in fact, so many resources were already flowing into the Roman hands. And if anything, so when we look at the world in general, and this is true also for other parts of Europe, the Romans brought to a veritable uniformation of rule, right? To an unprecedented degree. That's the same reason why we often point out the same Byzantine Empire that was very Romanized in a broader cultural sense, but remained otherwise very Hellenistically fractal in others, was sort of less tidy and less functional. For example, what the Latin Germanic world later will become. Rome had, especially in the West, would carry out a massive level of colonization, would properly alter the ethnocultural pattern of countries like Gaul, or like Spain, that were Romanized, and maintain, in fact, a more orderly pattern, even well after the Roman empires and compared to other parts of the Mediterranean. The same is true for Asia, right? So also the magnificence of Roman Asia in the following centuries owed much to the stabilization brought by Rome, if anything, in sort of compacting more individual centers of power, and in general informing the land with their imperial Catholic pneuma. The process of provincialization, later referred to by the same Romans as reductio in formam provinciae, which is a beautifully theological and metaphysical idea of properly giving form to the substance, right? It's the instantiation of divine order on earth, right? It can be distilled into a few key elements, right? You have, first of all, a proper Roman conquest. There is a manifestation of the imperium that, especially for these Hellenists, was remarkably important in spotting properly Alexander the Great's legacy in the East, and together with the notion that the Megas had not had to even fight in order to be recognized as a ruler. Of course, that's not how it happened in Asia with the same Alexander, not how it happened, in fact, not how it happened with the Romans, as we've seen. The Romans had to fight also against the Galatian Celts, the Battle of Mount Olympus. There were, as we've seen, also these other revolts, but overall, right, the same Attalids had notoriously supported Rome against the Seleucids, knowing pretty well that once Rome had settled business with the latter, they would have taken over, they would have hegemonized the area. So the Romans occupied these territories. They conquered them with military force. Then you have this imperium continuing in the figure of prominent senator with some, in fact, imperial magistracy tasked with organizing provincial territory with that kind of coercive power, supported by a commission of 10 or 5 senators in the process. There was the Senate's final ratification to properly reduce the province into form, as we could translate, was always essential, right? Only the Senate in Rome declared the establishment of a province, regardless of the centralized forms of control that still the Roman elite would exercise on certain countries and, again, other peoples. Upon completing such operations, the province could be properly formalized through a lex, so a law that would address a wide array of matters. First of all, the districtuation of the province, which identified, in fact, what were the main centers across the land. This had all a broader strategical logic, politically, militarily, economically. There was some proper Roman law issued for these lands under their imperium, including, most important of all, the regulation of land ownership. This was crucial. We've made lots of videos about the same Roman 2nd century, Italian 2nd century BC, and how many issues were occurring at that point as far as the land, the ager publicus, and so on. Made recently something about the Gracchi. We'll continue about that. And the determination, also perhaps more importantly, especially for an Hellenistic land, of the status of polis within the same province. Because essentially the master race in the East were the Greeks, right? These had already organized in their own mostly monarchical but still urban fashion through their colonization these various Eastern peoples. Now, when the Romans came, basically they were power sharing with the Greeks. They were subject to the Romans, but still separated from the rest. And given that the main form of Hellenic political organization was the polis, in fact, as the same etymology of the word comes from, the Romans had to recognize through what we have seen through districtuation, land distribution, which polis was in charge, right? And this was very relevant because there were naturally many different types of settlements, and it could be complicated in the East, especially differently from the Hellenic motherland. What a polis technically was. In any case, the Roman governor had a specific jurisdiction on different polis, sometimes not even on the entirety of them. Right, because we have created this idiotic view of the ancient world where we think it was a state with republics, democracy. This was completely alien to their mentality. They didn't think like this by any stretch of the imagination. This was basically a regulation by God-chosen peoples to be in different relations in cosmic order, right? And the Romans would exercise, for example, control over certain polis without even having the local governor exercising an actual jurisdiction on them, right? Some polis were more directly regulated by the governor, some less, some no, right? Not by any degree, in a formal legal sense. Naturally, this governance entailed taxation, tribute collection. There were two different things, by the way, and a set of restrictions imposed on the inhabitants, including, for example, a certain level of disarmament that in the Hellenistic world was already there from before the Roman conquest, the composition of local senates. So there were literal councils of all these various cities or multiple cities at once that would normally meet, as we've seen also again in the video about Bithynia and Pontus, in a specific city that was usually also chosen as the one of the Roman governor to facilitate things. But the governor, as we've seen, was also itinerant across different centers that would spend money to maintain this Roman court to get favors in exchange. And so, again, crystallizing further the Hellenistic sort of grip on these territories that the Romans at that point could simply dispose of. And also the very delicate question of the relations between Roman citizens and of different degrees, by the way, and the locals, right? Because, of course, the Roman citizens could do some things that others couldn't, even though they were foreigners in this land. And mostly it was a matter of exploiting the province. This lex could be subject to substantial revisions even long after the Roman conquest, as, of course, everything depended on the political circumstances. There was a degree of autonomy that Roman governors even had from Rome herself, right? And so this was pretty much used. We've seen it also in other provinces everywhere, right? Today we just sort of discuss it for the sake of completion. But for the Roman province of Asia, definitely the Romans had to think big, right? And so here some particular issues would arise. There were edicts the Romans issued on the top of the lex that updated the same. There was also a broader cultural, historical process whereby these peoples gradually accepted psychologically and politically the Roman presence, right? The main Hellenistic centers would think like they were ruled by the local oligarchs, would think to be still within a broader, perfect Hellenic world. And the Romans were there, but they were sort of an accident. And they would not care about anything else outside the Hellenic world, except the Romans, to a degree at least, for those who wanted to be to enter in the graces of the Roman governors and later also Romanization. There were in Asia vast fertile lands, especially along the coasts, and as well as semi-arid regions, especially in the hinterland. There were some local realms of sort, like especially if you enter the hinterland, there were these older, broader, we can call them Eastern, but there were also, in many cases, also Indo-European ancestral areas, not the Indo-Europeans probably, but that had settled there. And there were major temple estates, literal, sanctuaries that owned a vast amount of lands. When you think about medieval monasteries, episcopal seigniories, like the ancient world was the same identical thing, contrary to what you have been normally brainwashed to imagine, also and especially from a religious point of view. There were also barren islands and scattered rural settlements of some sort, all a set of, in fact, subjections already pre-existing between one another, ruled, etc., that the Romans more or less respected and or didn't care very much about as long as things kept flowing the right direction. The Hellenic polities were the most important element. There is no doubt about this. There were also some, as we've seen, that had rebelled, Hellenic colonies, right? Probably military settlements of more recent foundation that also lost their raison d'etre at that point, as the Romans had their own military, anything. That these communities kept, as we've seen also in other lands, a big deal of auxiliary support that would come through these means that were left to the locals. But these military colonies had degenerated into some sort of militias and levies, and there were mostly communities that had historically passed down generation after generation this craft of war, but that now was no more. As we've seen, the Attalids had neither even properly recruited a phalanx overall, right? But we've seen similar things in the Seleucid Empire in a video that described how the Syrian, the Mesopotamian, the Persian military colonies by geography were gradually in fact blending the local populations, and they sort of were lost to some point also after, like, in part the Roman conquest of Syria were hinted at before. The presence of such advanced urban centers helped the Romans from a logistical point of view a huge deal, right? It really helped to properly reach all the parts of the province. It provided with the necessary funds. It provided also with this, as we've seen, hierarchical framework of territorial domination. That's why the Romans basically didn't colonize this place, right? It was one of the most fiercely advanced Roman provinces, but not because of a Romano-Italic contribution just per se. It was, as we've seen, a matter of power aggregation, sometimes of capacity to control this better, but these lands were easily governable and left a bit on their own. And a symbol of also the Roman prize in terms of conquest, right? Again, there were wonders of the world, some of the most important Hellenistic capitals, and it was just so important for Rome to control these territories. You have, in fact, a particular Roman attachment to the Troad, for obvious sort of idea of divine ancestry. Augustus, also, walking in the footsteps of Alexander, founded Alexandria Troas, properly after the Megas, and there is all properly an Alexandrine dimension of Augustan rule, especially obviously in the East, that at some point we shall make a specific video on. We are in 12 BC, by the way. There were some Roman colonies, as you understand, but they were really minimal compared to the level of Hellenistic urbanization. The Romans, again, didn't need to colonize this place. There were the twin Caesarean colonies of Lampsacus and Parium, of which only the latter survived, by the way, because there had been the civil wars and so on. And the numerous colonies established from 25 BC in the newly formed province of Galatia, a region with few urban settlements, and that was in part, I think, Galatia would remain, and we will see it better. I think I made a video. Wait a minute, because it's years ago. I don't remember where I made Galatia. We made a video about the Galatians, yes, but a video about Roman Galatia, yes. Roman Galatia and Cappadocia. By the way, you can check that out because they're very interesting lands. And if I remember correctly, parts of historical Galatia, so this Celtic land, also occupying today's region of Ankara, right, and being subsumed in the west by the province of Asia, right? And that land, as we've seen, was sort of less urbanized, historically was less developed. That's also why the Celts had settled there to begin with. If you're interested in Galatian warfare, I also made a video about that. I haven't made a video about the Galatians as such, if I'm not wrong. So we will come back on that because we have also a series about Celtic peoples, if you're interested. And that's also very well liked. We'll naturally get to the Celtic provinces of Rome at some point. It's quite fascinating. I have a series also on the Roman conquest of Britain. If you're not aware, we will likely update this soon. One of the governor Manius Aquilius's initial decisions was also, in a typically Roman fashion, the construction of an extensive road network, radiating from Ephesus, linking the province's principal cities, extending into the Anatolian interior, and reaching as far as the Euphrates. Right. This proceeded on the path of the ancient Achaemenid royal roads that the same Macedons had been using. So again, this is completely normal. Of course, every civilization followed on what the others had already done. It would have been silly not to do. It's not a proof of backwardness. If anything, of course, the Romans established the best viatic system in antiquity, and consider that this is also like a branch of the intercontinental trade routes between China and Europe. All right, these are lands that, as you know, also in the Middle Ages, the Italians will keep ruling for their ports and having especially a quite relevant function in international commercial balance. So it's always there. Just think how much we celebrate the Roman conquest of the East and how many hysterical, distastefully ideological reasons there are. For example, against the Crusades, they were incredible and beautiful, by the way. But this is exactly what Western civilization was doing over again. The Romans, on the basis of this road system, could swiftly move their troops, facilitate commerce. Remember that the roads belonged to the army, which had the precedence over everybody because they literally built them, among the other things, aside from broader strategic, obvious reason. So Asia became ever more interconnected under Roman times. These works also, were involving the local labor force. Another significant measure for the province's administration that probably was started by Manius Aquilius, even though we don't have any explicit evidence, unfortunately, in the records, was the establishment of the conventus juridici. That is to say, some districts that exercised judicial administration. This, so bringing it to the various provincial communities, this districtuation likely started at the beginning of of Roman Asia, historically speaking, perhaps within already the first decade of Roman rule, right? We don't have the 100% evidence, but we understand also from, as we'll see now, secondary aspect, it was quite early. So basically, at least once a year, the governor or delegate visited the main polis of the land, where the conventus existed. And so they would preside over tribunals to properly dispense justice to the Roman citizens and, depending on the crimes at least, to the inhabitants of the cities and communities within each district. It's what you see like with Pilatus in Judea later on, right? Typically in the biblical scene. The Roman governor would stand there, and of course he was mostly concerned with the Roman citizens living there. And there were some specific capital issues that could not be administered by the local communities. The Roman would take over the control of that. It's a bit like what we see in the Middle Ages with the higher, lower justice system, etc. This to stress, of course, that the Romans were the masters of the land. And obviously, because the most important, the most serious crimes had often to do with things like brigandage, killing, so all things that disrupted properly public security and that the Romans had to take in consideration quite seriously and putting an end to that in quite brutal yet effective ways. Naturally, the conventus were located in the most important centers of the province, just by simplicity, so that the idea is that every corner of the province could have the biggest center in the nearby, obviously facilitating the access of the locals to justice, etc. Numerous sources demonstrate the value attributed by provincials to a rising city that served the seat of judicial district. The desire to outshine rival polis, to boast titles to display in every context, and to hold a superior rank that ultimately establish a hierarchy is naturally very, very pronounced in the East, but in particular even more in the civic life of the Asian polis, right? Because there were many, as we've seen, there was an incredible demographic density and wealth and interest and so on. So the Hellenistic establishments, oligarchy, I mean, it's not like, lesser people accessed this. Nobody cared about them. They were not important or meaningful in the picture. They were also clientelary under this other more important one. So dealing with this was mostly like this fierce competition between Greeks mostly to enter the graces of the Romans through this. And again, we have seen this in other videos about the Eastern provinces. That at some point, well, I don't want to divide Eastern, Western provinces in the playlist, but you can find that in the major playlist content. Without mentioning, of course, that exercising justice or having an influence of the same meant an enormous amount of income flowing into your hands, right? Because all issues about land occupation, all this kind of capital punishment were definitely a way to control society. And so the elite that managed to aligned with the Romans on this, could also do a bit as they wanted. In fact, as we explained here, there were some crimes that the Romans looked at, but it's not like even this single kind of crime under Roman law was always looked at, right? The Romans essentially look at the things that interested them and intervene. Otherwise, they let the local establishment dealing with this stuff with their own law, because the Greeks, these other Asian peoples, had their own laws and their ways of exercising justice and so on, right? It's a bit, again, with Pilatus and Christ versus Barabbas, right? That's literally, what do you want me to do? And that's, of course, like why Pilatus, passes for a bad figure. But it was also that Roman pragmatic way of saying, do we need to trigger a revolt here? What we need to do? We can discern a unified framework of governance and territorial organization that would be later implemented by the governor Quintus Veranius in the provincialization of Lycia, right? And there we are fortunately documented, so we can look better at the Roman incredible capacity for immediate and thorough appropriation of territory. Like that, they were pretty swift, hawkish in their capacity to properly incorporate this into the empire, so that even the early primitive Roman government was actually very straightforwardly effective, and was especially, and this is striking, incredibly aware of the local realities. Right? It's not like the Romans were foreigners, but they knew basically everything about these people before they came. And this was kind of obvious. I mean, if you had been campaigning around that, you already knew what are the most important centers, where there is more wealth. So once you take over the land, you already know where to rule it to begin with, because this is an eminently imperial domination. The Roman magistrates were operating in ways that we don't necessarily fully see for Asia. We are well documented for Sicily, for example, obviously enough, where the division of the province into smaller jurisdictional units was older, first of all, but also is more documented. Livy, for example, discusses this as early as 199 BC for Sicily. This is Livy 31:29-9. So again, regarding the aforementioned corruption, as we'll see now, that existed because the entire world worked like that. There wasn't a single government that didn't work by bribing, by corruption. And this was obviously the part of it. Like, I mean, there wasn't a civilized way to control these. Either you killed everybody or you bribed them, right? And this is typical of every single political system of the time, everywhere. The Romans weren't, in this sense, particularly, more corrupt, as some people, for some reason, want to believe. In the eyes of the Romans, naturally, provinces were just mostly this source of wealth and power. So we don't have necessarily to force too many distinctions. It's obvious, however, that there would be also a similarity between the ways the Romans properly ruled different provinces without too many other complications, without, however, denying that there was always a particularism in the way that they did so. From the Sicilian sources, we can look at, for example, the contracting and payment of the vectigo. What we know also from Asia is really similar to Sicily, for example. The choice of a proportional tax, for example, that is to say the tithe on harvests, right? It's obvious that, the Romans would apply the broader tithe on harvests in general, right, across different provinces more or less in the same way. And again, Sicily and Asia were disproportionately overly advanced compared to really most other Roman provinces in theory or yet to conquer. But the basis of wealth was always agrarian at the end of the day. Sicily and Asia were also, again, overwhelmingly fertile lands, as a matter of fact. There were well-advanced urban systems with already cadastral systems already available. So literally the Romans could look at these provinces and knowing more or less what kind of land existed, where who owned that, how much it yielded, etc. So rationalizing and smoothing all the taxation process and facilitating therefore properly the income, also the amount of resources extracted. Surely the Attalid taxation system would have had some legacy in Roman Asia, even though we don't know too much, right? The Lex Portori Asiae contains some references to a tallied fiscal practice, which would have likely been tailored again to Asia in some more particular way. But again, the foundations of power were pretty much the same. The Lex Portori Asiae survives through essentially an inscription, and that is of incredible historical meaning because it basically contains regulations concerning customs and duties in Asia. And it's also a mixed text of sort. I mean, it has basically a list of decisions taken in different periods. So also, this is interesting, for example, as a medievalist, because when you study, the Carolingian laws of the famous capitularies within the more or less the Latin Germanic tradition of the time, you realize that the capitularies, that there were some foundational laws of the various peoples, just like at this point, on an ethnic basis. But then there would be this royal imperial legislation issued different capitularies every once in a while that literally were eventually to be part of the broader text codes, but dating to different eras. And of course, given the general level of development of these pre-industrial societies, they were also pretty similarly applicable and, in this sense, time-resilient issues. This source, in fact, provides us these provisions at least from 75 BC to 62 AD. We are at the time of Nero in the latter end. This is very interesting. And in 123 BC, starting with the Lex Sempronia, the local tax was collected in Asia through the aforementioned tithe system rather than a fixed tribute. The tithe, which means that basically the Roman administration was managing to properly, infiltrate more directly into the examination of the local land, so to distribute more evenly and more justly this tax, because otherwise they would have said, Asia, give us this amount of wealth as a form of tribute, and they would, and God knew only where the local elites got that from. So the Romans, obviously, for the sake of good government, which, as we will see, Asia will actually become, especially in the early empire, before the Roman predations of the previous centuries, was in fact consolidated over time at this point. How was the tithe collected? Well, basically through contracting procedures. That's where we have the greatest instances of corruption, as you can imagine. This was conducted in Rome, by the way. I mean, these matters were decided in Rome, and then the various agents were sent. The censor dealt with this, and it was done every 5 years. It was known as the locatio censoria. The tax was calculated proportionally to harvests, interestingly enough. However, the same agents paid the publicani contractors a monetary equivalent of the tithe at times. And for the latter, it wasn't much of an issue. At least that's where, again, the corruption really stayed, because in this way, the local elites that were in charge of the land of the peasants could and would do whatever more or less they wanted in that type of extraction. It was not really nice. It increased all a series of problems locally. It's also why, for example, the Attalids rebelled when the Romans arrived, not because the Romans had already done anything. If anything, they had been allied of the Attalids, but because the Attalids had, in fact, been as abusive with their own people as all the establishment at the time as they could. Again, in the Hellenistic world, there isn't much thing like, widespread liberty or things like this. That they're much more sort of subject worlds, that very differently from Rome, that was already pretty oligarchic at this point in history. And by the way, that's why I was saying before, corruption aside, in the sense that find a single polity where this not happened on a regular sort of self-identifying basis. This was actually a relatively efficient collection procedures. It also, for example, through the subcontracting, and the greater logistical dispersion of the collection helped as far as storage problems were concerned. Transportation of enormous quantities of grain from a distant province in this way were not also so crushing to the population because the extraction was in a way or another better distributed than the tribute. Which meant, by the way, that the Romans could also strategically look at the local economy and say, well, now I want more of this kind of products or more of this other. It was really typical because naturally all this stuff, was imported to Italy, and it largely ended up in the hands of the Romano-Italic aristocracy that was involved in the same rule of the provinces. And so obviously that's how the circle is closed. The contracting to publicani companies also relieved the res publica of the task of collection, allowed it to access the sums that the same publicani were required to advance at the time of the contract. So in other words, you give me already that, because these publicani already had wealth in their hands, so they anticipated that to the state immediately, and then they chased their wealth locally with all the extortive means that you can imagine. That's why, in fact, there was also generalized hatred against the Romans as a whole. I mean, this is pretty much present everywhere, as there had been a generalized hatred against the Macedons, but as long as they functionally were in charge, they couldn't, be touched and wouldn't be touched. It's only when, Rome was involved in different clashes, there was Spartacus, there was Sertorius, that Mithridates takes the chance and slaughters basically all the Roman citizens in Asia. And the thing did not end well for Pontus, in case you don't know. And that was kind of obvious. These were desperate moves to try to do what? To get just a temporary breath, hoping it will help you later, with constant gamble, and Rome eventually steamrolled all these places. The Romans were quite predatory. There is no doubt about this. But also, again, pretty good at what they were doing, and also in maintaining this kind of resources, not sort of exhausting them. Aside from, of course, wars that would happen and, would always be disruptive in many ways. The publicani companies, however, were sort of the bad companies of the situation. They were maximizing profit through any mean. Some inscriptions recall the brazen use of violence by saying publicani in disputes with provincials. Like, I'm Roman, who are you? And they would kill them. That's absolutely understandable, even just by Roman mentality. We've seen how Rome was in the 2nd century BC. I mean, there wasn't, again, this sort of weird idea that we have of the Romans as, decadently sophisticated. And they were rigidly primitive. Warlike people, properly confident in the fact that God had entrusted them the, in fact, divine mission of taking over the entire world as the chosen race. That's how they were living by, right? There was nothing else in their cultural mental horizons. That's how they behaved with anyone, and that's why they actually took over the world. That's the attitude you must have. And obviously, there wasn't just much hatred towards the Romans as a consequence, but also towards all that had associated with them, because as we've seen, the establishment was largely with them. In fact, when you look at what happened with Mithridates VI in his war against Rome, it wasn't just about Rome. It was also about these Hellenistic elites that, having been conquered by the Romans, could also not quite defend themselves and were pretty darn rich, and the Pontics were not, at least as rich, and they went for it. They went after them as much as they would against the Romans. The majority of Asia's polis seemed, however, eager to entrust themselves to the king of Pontus, which shows at least that a part of the establishment had been heavily suffering of the Roman impositions as well. And then again, when the Pontics arrived, things would differently go. It's always the same picture, though. At some point, it's the same Greeks that in part secretly instructed by the king in advance, massacred approximately 8,000 Romans and Italians. That, in fact, is one of the most injurious actions ever committed against the at this point the res publica, and that will be severely paid by the perpetrators. And also what was, generally speaking, going on in the empire. There are so many, independent Roman, think about Lucullus, that alone began to conquer stuff in the East. I mean, it's a very fractal moment in Roman history, and it will take the emergence of the great warlords of the 1st century BC to properly put things back in order. But it was naturally a messed up war. I mean, a world where such things happen is not a world that is going to emerge better from this, or more autonomous or freer at all. And that's in fact exactly what happens. Roman civilization took over and triumphed. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, was the guy who dealt with the Pontics. As consul in 800 BC, he famously defeated the Pontics that had entered Greece, just like as the Seleucids had done back in the day. Think about the Battle of Thermopylae. I made a video about that too as well. And the Romans were famously victorious at Chaeronea. Hell of a battle, we have to say that. And also at Orchomenus. And could eventually there cross the Aegean again into Asia, where the local polis had at that point began to revolt against Mithridates themselves. Like, whoops, but we don't know anything about what happened. But obviously there were different factions battling against one another, and the Romans were aware of who was who there. But again, blood would run. In fact, this was settled by the agreement of Dardanus in the Troad in August of 85 BC. At least Pontus kept existing, Asia returned to the Romans, and Sulla redrew the administrative map of the province once again after this major upheaval. All polis that had supported Mithridates lost their privileges, and they were punished with extreme severity. Right? The Romans exterminated lots of people, rightly so. And while those that had remained supportive, faithful to Rome, obtained exemptions and prospered. Right, the best policy that you can definitely pursue as an empire, and Asia will actually prosper on these bases. Obviously, the age of civil wars, as you know, was not over. And let's say it's not like the Romans cared very much about Asia in, human or cultural terms. They were in fact involved in their own issues, and this is the age of the social war with the other major dynamics going on in the same Italy. And in general, the Romans didn't, in fact, see any issue in relinquishing the enormous profits that could be obtained from a province that, through that ruthless system of exploitation, could have even contributed more to other financial, internal, political issues. But, of course, this was not the political moment where to tell that to the Romans, right? And so things proceeded, generally speaking, throughout more or less the same so-called Republican period in the same way, administratively wise. Cicero, that tells us about this in the De Officiis 322 and 87 to 88, was more sensitive to these issues. As you know, he had experiences in Sicily where he had also condemned the abuses of the Romans. At some point against the same Roman citizens. So Cicero was a great man in different ways and understood how essential a positive, benign, firm, but still just governance was for Rome's survival in a broader sense. Yet things, in fact, will not change until the Augustan organization of the empire, right? In fact, during this increasingly privatistic, in this sense unsupervised, oligarchic rule of the provinces, the publicani companies tied to the Roman elite had become extremely powerful and, as a consequence, almost untouchable, probably at the local level as well. They had lots of slaves, they could exercise violence on whomever, and this was not very good, of course, for the administration. There is also, in virtue of this enrichment, notorious publicani subsumption into the equestrian order, again, the Quaestio de Repetundis is an incredibly fascinating issue. I think I made a video once about that. In any case, this court tasked with supervising over concussion, other, in fact, crimes were very common in the exploitation of the provinces, was majorly battled on in the Roman elite. And in fact, the Publicani were the major Roman financiers, tied to the same members of the senatorial order who had to supervise on all these issues. You understand that it's a vicious circle. The senators had in fact invested portions of their vast wealth, of their latifundi, into the affairs of the contracting companies across the provinces, so basically paving the way for their further control of the same. The scandalous control of tribunals by these categories constituted naturally a strong deterrent and threat against actions of honest governors, right, attentive to welfare of provincials. The governors had probably the public authority, but they didn't have the private power of these individuals. So this was an erosive dynamic. Even a powerful and victorious general like the aforementioned Lucullus, according to Plutarch, Lucullus 4:1 and 20, was deprived of his command in Asia due to measures that he had taken in favor of the province, contrasting these crimes. It's evident that at the end of the so-called Republican period, Rome had not yet developed the legal framework to protect provincial populations, and had basically no interest in the moment to support governors that, having committed to the defense of the same provinces, had ended up, receiving, the antagonism of powerful figures in the Roman political system. The change happens basically towards a more monarchic imperial direction of Rome. And this is also a very important perspective in historical terms. I mean, a private oligarchic system, historically speaking, turns out to be deleterious in a broader sense. Like even a more monarchic imperial picture, while not eliminating, of course, every issue, but is actually the one that can contrast this unhinged establishment. In fact, the one who started properly fixing this was the same Julius Caesar, when in 48 BC shifted from the system of the Publicani to once again a fixed tribute, reduced, so basically temporarily abandoning the method of capillary exploitation by returning to the older model, paradoxically, to the one in which the elites had to collect their own wealth and provide it without any other wealth required, and in this sense an actual cut of the Publicani from their Roman power basis, given also that Caesar was basically had taken over the system now, also campaigned in Anatolia, and so was really the master there. The tributes were collected thus from the individual polis, not from the Publicani. We know this from Plutarch's Life of Caesar 48, Appian, the Civil War 5:4, and Cassius Dio 42:6-3. We're in part also read some of these sources from the video about Pharsalus that I made a couple of months ago. Naturally, Caesar's death triggered another round of civil wars that disrupted further the provincial world in general. The Parthians, even exploiting the temporary Roman weakness, invaded as far as Asia, so literally reaching Anatolia. This is very interesting because, it routinely happens at different times in history. The Persians always tried, but they always also failed in general sense. And this is, however, explained if you realize that Quintus Labienus, that was a Roman defector, had sided with the Arsacids in order to sabotaged the system and also got punished at the end of the day for that. Asia was exhausted in those generations, so that the actual enormous fixing happened with Octavian. His final victory at Actium in 31 BC that reunites basically the entirety of the Roman world under his monarchy. Naturally, there is still a provincial rule, but a much more mitigated one. And so for all to say, oh, Augustus propaganda, this was bad, it was better. I don't know why people are so anti-Romanistic sometimes, but this is what history tells us very clearly. The governance of provinces ceased to be a financial tool for political struggles under Augustus. And this is kind of obvious and self-evident. Peace, which means a lot, especially after the age of civil war, and thus the tranquility and well-being of the provinces became a priority in the eyes of Octavian. It's possible to highlight a trend that in fact ran through the Principate from Augustus onward, so it didn't stop just to his rule. That is to say, the stop to the imposition of excessive burdens of the provinces, right? Assisting them in times of extraordinary calamities, avoiding overly greedy or cruel governors, and providing provincials with legal tools to defend themselves against corrupt governors. Naturally, this was happening in a pattern of gradual Romanization, further subjecting to this order. Again, it's not like these people were happy to be ruled by foreigners in general, but Rome was stabilizing the system. It was offering probably some means to repair damage, to consolidate this broader territorial domination. Nobody wanted to see the Parthians anymore entering these lands. And so the system helped the Romans. The same, again, Hellenistic establishment, as we've seen, was within it. The same Augustus founds new cities. There is all a positive framework within which Asia keeps thriving its full potential. Some imperial edicts, or even simple instructions called as mandata, show that the general purpose of the Romans and of the provincials collimated, essentially, even just out of the sake of imperial public opinion, so to say. It's a big term, let's say, in Roman times, but still, like in the establishment itself, that was the same senatorial one. The emperor did not have to show discontent provinces, right? And obviously, the provincials wanted to, themselves evade abuses and being protected. So if everybody cooperated, you see how it works with civilization. If there is an actual formula, an actual belief, an idea that by now, like the Romans have settled this unprecedentedly powerful empire, Mediterranean, we are in it. We are some of the most advanced places. Is it that bad? No. All right. It would have not been this great match for the average person, but the average person was not that important, right? The establishment was, and because, of course, those people also had sort of less capacity to do anything, just out of their quality, right? There were some places in the empire that were more rebellious and tried and failed, but at least, let's say, things were tested, and the Roman Empire did really establish a pax, which was metaphysically intended to cover the entire cosmic order, which, think about, as we've seen, the marvels of Asia were a great part of in this period. By the way, Asia was a senatorial province, which means it was also run by senators. This was different from the so-called Republican period, because at that point, Asia was governed by former praetors, which were therefore not. They were delegated to exercise some function, not to simply establish some broader, also private interest in there. So the same senators were not interested in any overwhelming, say, exploitation of a system that they had to rest on, because that would have been exhausted. Whereas the previous publicani, the praetors, and the senators in Rome did not care about Asia when they hadn't properly stabilized that, hadn't properly strengthened its sort of connection with the senatorial latifundia themselves. The proof of Roman success in Asia is that this province required only minimal military presence, which existed at the borders in Phrygian territory and at Eumeneia and Apamea. So these were basically the easternmost areas. At least Phrygia was in the north, and it was in fact because there was some coastal threat from Black Sea and all the, these raiders from the steppes, and also a bit from, as we've seen, especially in the video with Galatia and Cappadocia, they were fundamentally more militarized provinces, and quite in fact strategic ones. It's on that border that if you are in Asia, you want to stamp things from happening. Like after all, as we've seen, parts of Asia were basically Galatian, so they were not even particularly developed places. You can't have the Roman military station there without anyone caring more than much. Besides, the Romans knew how to maintain their military at this point. It could become professional and permanent. And so even the same presence in the province was a sort of honor, but it was really probably not needed because everything was running smoothly. Minimal differences by the mid-3rd century, Phrygia and Caria were detached from Asia. Also, the city of Aphrodisias became the so-called capital, as we've seen with all the distinctions we made before, of the new province. Aphrodisias was famous in history because of its sacred prostitution. All right, it was just named after Aphrodite for also for this reason. It would also be still in Justinian's time one of the largest cities in the empire, interestingly enough, and one of the few Asian ones, meaning that actually the greatest cities in the empire at the time of Justinian were in the west, contrary to general belief, meaning that this center had sort of maintained itself in a decent way. Diocletian, by the way, would further, as you know, reform the Roman provincial system with smaller districts, but more or less this, in fact, followed the pattern that had occurred during the 3rd century crisis. And so you see also that Diocletian wasn't even changing things out of the blue without any previous doing or connection. And this was essentially the history of Roman Asia in very, again, simple provincial fashion. We will talk soon about, if you like this series, tell me if you like this series, because, of course, it's cool if you can complete the entire Roman Empire. But as you've seen, I've waited so much, it wasn't this crucial. At the end of the day, some people like these topics less, or I don't know. I've gotten lots of views for certain provinces. I can... let me see which, because there is something, a playlist, as I was saying before, with provincial history. And no, there isn't. Oh, why? Province properly isn't there. No, there isn't. Well, doesn't matter. I can't recreate one for that matter. I can't. This doesn't go by title because it's more like by name, Roman Asia in this case. But I have made a couple of just a couple of other videos about, and the others I think were Mauritania, Cyrenaica, Egypt. There were lots of eastern ones, and in fact Pontus, Bithynia. We made Moise, if I'm not wrong. Did I? I don't remember certain things. That's why I should create a playlist. Yeah, Roman, Moise, and Trace. I should also actually use the Latin for that in any case. Most in the East. So it means that if others come up, it will mostly tend to be in the West as well, in Europe at least. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.